April 15th, 1944. North Atlantic. 0847 hours. Boom. The first explosion ripped through the freezing water at 200 feet below the surface. Inside U-448, 44 German sailors felt their world collapse in an instant. The pressure hull cracked like an eggshell. Seawater rushed in with the force of a locomotive. Men screamed, metal groaned, and then silence. On the surface, Commander James Rowley of HMS Whale heard 3 sharp cracks through his headphones. Not the rumbling thunder of depth charges. Something different. Something final. 16 minutes later, U-473 died the same way. 11 minutes after that, U-10001 joined them at the bottom. But that was just the beginning. By 0917 hours, 7 German Type VII submarines lay crushed on the ocean floor. 231 men dead. Total elapsed time from first contact to last kill, 30 minutes. When Admiral Karl Donitz received the report at Marine headquarters, he threw it across his desk and called it propaganda. Impossible, he said. The British cannot destroy 7 submarines in half an hour. Our commanders have survived hundreds of depth charge attacks. This is a lie. It was not a lie. The weapon that killed those submarines was called the Hedgehog. And the man who designed it was not an admiral, not a general, not even a military officer. He was a civilian engineer named Charles Goodeve who had never commanded a warship in his life. This is the story of how one man's ridiculous idea changed submarine warfare forever and turned the hunters into the hunted. To understand why the Hedgehog was revolutionary, you need to understand the nightmare that was the Battle of the Atlantic in 1942. Picture this. You are a merchant sailor on a cargo ship crossing from New York to Liverpool. Your vessel is one of 50 in a convoy, sailing in tight formation through the most dangerous waters on Earth. The North Atlantic in winter is hell frozen over. Waves tower 50 feet high. Winds scream at gale force. The temperature hovers below freezing. Sleet and spray reduce visibility to almost nothing. And somewhere beneath those mountainous waves, German U-boats are stalking you. You cannot see them. You cannot hear them. You only know they are there when a torpedo slams into the ship next to yours and men start dying. The merchant sailors who crewed these cargo ships were not soldiers. They were stevedores, fishermen, ordinary seamen from ports around the world. Many were in their 40s and 50s, too old for military service, but young enough to haul freight across an ocean that wanted to kill them. They wore heavy wool coats and life preservers around the clock because they knew that if a torpedo struck, they might have seconds to abandon ship into water so cold it could kill in minutes. In 1942 alone, German U-boats sank 1,664 Allied ships. That is more than 4 ships every single day. 6 million tons of cargo sent to the bottom. Food that would never feed British families. Oil that would never fuel British tanks. Ammunition that would never reach British soldiers. Winston Churchill later wrote that the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. If the convoy routes were cut, Britain would starve. The war would be lost. Democracy itself might fall. The Royal Navy threw everything it had at the problem. Destroyers, corvettes, and frigates escorted the convoys. Aircraft patrolled from bases in Iceland and Newfoundland. Every ship was equipped with ASTIC, the British version of sonar. And they had depth charges, hundreds of thousands of depth charges. But here was the problem. Depth charges did not work. Oh, they look impressive. 400 pounds of high explosive dropped over the side of a ship, sinking into the darkness, detonating with a massive boom that could be heard for miles. But the kill rate was pathetic. In 1942, escort vessels expended an average of more than 500 depth charges for every single U-boat they managed to sink. Why? Because depth charges had a fatal flaw built into their very design. To drop a depth charge, a warship had to sail directly over the submarine. But ASTIC could only see forward and down. Directly beneath the ship was a blind spot, which meant that in the final moments of every attack, the most critical seconds, the hunting ship lost contact with its target. It was like trying to throw darts at a bullseye while closing your eyes for the last 3 steps. German U-boat commanders knew this weakness and exploited it ruthlessly. The moment they heard the distinctive ping of Aztecs searching for them, they would crash dive, change course, and vary their depth. By the time the depth charges exploded, the submarine was often hundreds of meters away, creeping towards safety, while its hunters searched blindly in the turbulent water. The mathematics were brutal. Ships were being sunk faster than they could be built. Sailors were dying faster than they could be replaced, and no one had any idea how to fix it. But everything was about to change because of a man no one in the Admiralty had ever heard of. Charles Goodeve was not supposed to be designing weapons. He was a Canadian-born physicist who had been working on degaussing systems, the magnetic countermeasures that protected ships from German mines. He was methodical, precise, and possessed of an inventor's mindset that looked at problems sideways rather than head-on. In 1941, the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development gave Goodeve a seemingly impossible assignment: develop an anti-submarine weapon that could be fired forward from an attacking ship. The traditional naval officers laughed. Fire forward? That went against everything they knew about anti-submarine warfare. Depth charges were dropped from astern. That was how it had always been done. That was how it would always be done. But Goodeve did not care about tradition. He cared about mathematics. And the mathematics said that maintaining sonar contact during an attack would dramatically increase the kill rate if a ship could fire weapons forward while still tracking the submarine. There would be no blind spot, no guesswork, no desperate hope that the submarine had not moved. The solution Goodeve proposed seemed absurd. Instead of one massive depth charge, he wanted to fire 24 small bombs in an oval pattern ahead of the ship. Each bomb would weigh only 65 pounds compared to the 400 pounds of a standard depth charge. And here was the truly crazy part. They would not explode at a predetermined depth. They would only detonate on direct contact with a submarine's hull. The admirals were skeptical. You want us to throw 24 tiny bombs into the ocean and hope one of them hits? What about all the bombs that miss? They will just sink harmlessly to the bottom. Goodeve's response was mathematically elegant. Yes, most bombs would miss, but the pattern would cover an area roughly 100 feet in diameter. The Type VII U-boat was 67 feet long and 20 feet wide. If the attacking ship had accurate sonar contact, which it would, because the ship could track right up to the moment of firing, the probability of at least one bomb hitting was actually quite high. And those small bombs were far more lethal than they appeared. 65 pounds of Torpex explosive detonating in direct contact with a pressure hull would punch through it like a can opener. No submarine could survive that. The admirals still were not convinced. This was insane. This went against every doctrine they had ever learned. They wanted bigger bombs, more explosive power, more destruction. Goodeve wanted precision. The argument went back and forth for months. The traditional officers called the concept ridiculous, suicidal, a waste of resources that would get sailors killed. But Goodeve had one powerful ally: necessity. The U-boats were winning. Something had to change. In early 1941, the first Hedgehog prototype was built. The launcher consisted of 24 spigot mortars arranged in 4 rows of 6, mounted on a steel framework on the forecastle of a ship. Each mortar was a fixed rod under which a bomb was loaded. The whole assembly could fire in less than 3 seconds, sending all 24 bombs arcing through the air in a carefully calculated pattern. The first tests were disastrous. The bombs tumbled in flight, scattering the pattern unpredictably. Engineers added stabilizing fins and carefully balanced each projectile. The contact fuses proved unreliable. Some bombs failed to detonate, even when they clearly struck the target during tests against decommissioned vessels. The fuse design was refined multiple times until reliability exceeded 90%. There was also the problem of training. The Hedgehog required precise Aztec tracking and perfect timing. Fire too early, and the submarine could dive beneath the pattern. Fire too late, and it might pass beyond effective range. Fire at the wrong angle, and the entire salvo would miss. By late 1942, the weapon was finally ready for operational deployment. The first Real kill came in December 1942. HMS Gabbard attacked an Italian submarine in the Mediterranean. The contact detonation was heard clearly on the ship's astic, a sharp, distinctive crack, utterly different from the rumbling boom of a depth charge. Moments later, debris and oil surfaced. The concept worked. More successes followed throughout 1943. HMS Sunflower sank U-952 in the North Atlantic. HMS Lagan destroyed U-229. HMS Pelican accounted for U-371. Each attack followed the same pattern: precise tracking, careful positioning, a salvo of Hedgehog bombs, then the sharp crack of contact detonation, and the telltale signs of a dying submarine. The statistics were remarkable. While depth charges required hundreds of attempts to sink a single U-boat, Hedgehog achieved kills on roughly 1 in 4 attacks. The success rate was 6 times higher than conventional weapons. Word spread through the convoy escort groups. Ships equipped with Hedgehog became prized assignments. Crews who had spent months fruitlessly depth-charging submerged contacts now had a weapon that actually worked. When German naval intelligence first received reports of the new British weapon, they dismissed it as propaganda. A forward-throwing bomb launcher that only exploded on contact. Impossible. Their submarines were invincible. They had survived hundreds of attacks. This was simply British lies designed to boost morale. Admiral Donitz himself refused to believe the early reports. The Marine doctrine stated clearly that Type VII submarines, when properly handled, could survive multiple depth charge attacks. The mathematics supported this. Submarines had time to maneuver. The ocean was vast. Escape was always possible. They did not understand that the mathematics had changed. The Hedgehog eliminated the blind spot. It maintained contact until the moment of attack. It provided immediate feedback because the contact fuses only detonated on a hit. If you heard the sharp crack, you knew the submarine was dead. If you heard nothing, you knew you had missed and could fire again within minutes. The German submarine commanders began calling the new weapon something different. They stopped calling it propaganda. They started calling it Igel, the Hedgehog, and they spoke of it with fear. But everything you have heard so far was just the prelude. The weapon had proven itself in scattered engagements across the Atlantic. It had achieved impressive kill rates against individual submarines. What no one had seen yet was what would happen when multiple Hedgehog-equipped ships encountered a coordinated wolf pack of U-boats. No one had witnessed the weapon's true, devastating potential. That was about to change on the morning of April 15, 1944. Convoy HX-286 was sailing eastward toward Liverpool. 47 merchant ships loaded with food, fuel, and ammunition. German intelligence had identified the route and vectored 7 Type VII U-boats to intercept. They were veteran boats with experienced crews, commanded by officers who had survived dozens of depth charge attacks. They had no idea what was waiting for them. In Part 2, we will witness the most devastating 30 minutes in submarine warfare history. We will stand on the bridge of HMS Whale as Commander Rowley hunts 7 submarines. We will hear the sharp cracks of contact detonation. We will watch as 231 German sailors die in rapid succession. And we will see the moment when Admiral Donitz finally understood that the hunters had become the hunted. The question that remained was simple. Could the Hedgehog change the entire course of the Battle of the Atlantic? Could one weapon designed by a civilian engineer actually determine the outcome of the war? The answer would shock everyone. In Part 1, we met Charles Goodeve, a civilian engineer who designed a weapon that the entire Royal Navy called impossible. His Hedgehog, a forward-throwing mortar system that fired 24 contact fuse bombs, had proven itself in scattered engagements across the Atlantic. The kill rate was 6 times higher than depth charges. Submarines that had survived hundreds of conventional attacks were being destroyed in minutes. But proving a weapon works and convincing the Admiralty to adopt it were 2 very different battles. Here is a statistic that will make your blood boil. In the first 6 months after Hedgehog proved its effectiveness, only 12 ships were equipped with a new weapon. 12 ships. Meanwhile, U-boats continued sinking 4 Allied vessels every single day. Thousands of merchant sailors drowned in freezing water while admirals argued about doctrine and tradition. And this is where everything became much, much worse. The man standing in Goodeve's way was not a German admiral. He was not a U-boat commander. He was Vice Admiral Percy Noble, Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, the man responsible for protecting every convoy crossing the Atlantic. And he hated the Hedgehog. Noble was 62 years old in 1942. He had joined the Royal Navy in 1898, served in the Boxer Rebellion, commanded destroyers in the First World War, and risen through the ranks by. Following established doctrine, he had seen dozens of miracle weapons come and go. He had watched young engineers promise revolution and deliver nothing but wasted resources. In his experience, innovation was dangerous. Tradition won wars. When Goodeve requested a meeting to discuss accelerated Hedgehog deployment, Noble agreed, but not because he was interested. He agreed because he wanted to end the conversation permanently. The meeting took place in Liverpool on March 3, 1942. Noble sat behind his desk, flanked by 3 senior captains. Goodeve stood alone. Noble did not offer him a seat. "I have read your reports, Mr. Goodeve," Noble began. "Impressive numbers. 1 kill per 4 attacks. Very impressive indeed. But I have been fighting submarines for 40 years, and I have learned something about weapons that work in theory." "Sir, this is not theory," Goodeve replied. HMS Gabbard confirmed a kill in December. HMS Sunflower in January. The weapon works. Noble waved his hand dismissively. "Isolated incidents. Your weapon requires perfect ASTA contact, perfect timing, perfect conditions. How often do we have perfect conditions in the North Atlantic? Never. That is the answer. Never. The depth charge requires the same conditions and achieves far worse results." Noble's face reddened. "The depth charge has protected convoys for 25 years. It is proven. It is reliable. Your contraption is untested in fleet operations, and you want me to refit every escort ship in the Atlantic. Do you have any idea what that would cost? How many ships would be out of service during conversion? I want you to save lives, sir." The room went silent. One of the captains coughed nervously. No one spoke to Vice Admiral Noble like that. Noble stood slowly. "Mr. Goodeve, you are a civilian. You design weapons. You do not understand operations. You do not understand logistics. And you certainly do not understand the Royal Navy. I am recommending that your Hedgehog program be suspended pending further review. We will revisit this matter in 18 months. 18 months. In 18 months, at the current rate, U-boats would sink another 2,000 ships. 50,000 sailors would die." Goodeve left the meeting knowing his career was finished. He had challenged the wrong admiral. The Hedgehog would gather dust in warehouses while the Atlantic filled with corpses. But Goodeve had made one mistake in his assessment. He assumed he was alone. He was not. Captain Frederick John Walker was 45 years old and the most successful U-boat hunter in the Royal Navy. His escort group had sunk more submarines than any other commander. He was aggressive, unconventional, and completely uninterested in what admirals thought about his methods. Walker had heard about the Hedgehog through unofficial channels. He had studied the reports. He had done his own calculations. And he had reached a conclusion that put him directly against Vice Admiral Noble. The Hedgehog was not just effective. It was the future of anti-submarine warfare. Anyone who could not see that was a fool. Walker requested a meeting with Goodeve in April 1942. They met in a pub in Portsmouth, far from the Admiralty's eyes. "I read what happened with Noble," Walker said, sliding a pint across the table. "The old man is fighting the last war. Half the Admiralty is fighting the last war. They will not change until the U-boats are sinking ships in the Thames." "Then what do you suggest?" Goodeve asked. "My program is suspended. I cannot even requisition parts." Walker smiled. "Noble suspended the official program. He cannot suspend me. I am sailing in 3 weeks with my escort group. I want Hedgehogs on my ships. That is impossible. The conversions would take months. You would need Admiralty approval. You would need. I need 12 launchers, ammunition, and 3 days in dry dock. Can you provide that?" Goodeve stared at him. "If Noble finds out, let me worry about Noble. Can you provide the equipment?" It was insane. It was insubordination. It could end both their careers. Goodeve nodded. I can provide it. Walker grinned. Then we have a deal. If this works, Noble will have no choice but to approve full deployment. If it fails, he shrugged, then we both find new careers. The conversion happened in secret over the next 3 weeks. Goodeve personally supervised the installation on Walker's flagship HMS Starling and 3 other sloops in the second escort group. The work was done at night, away from official inspection. Parts were requisitioned under false pretenses. Paperwork disappeared into filing cabinets that would never be opened. On May 14, 1942, Walker's group sailed to escort convoy HG-84 from Gibraltar to Liverpool for ships, for Hedgehogs, and one chance to prove everything. The convoy consisted of 32 merchant vessels. German intelligence had identified the route and dispatched a wolf pack of 9 U-boats to intercept. It was exactly the kind of situation that had been destroying convoys all year. Walker was counting on it. The first contact came on May 17th at 0342 hours. HMS Starling's Aztec operator reported a solid return, bearing 245 degrees, range 1,200 yards. A submarine was positioning for an attack on the convoy's port flank. Walker ordered action stations and brought his ship around to intercept. The night was black. Waves crashed against the hull. Wind howled across the deck. The Hedgehog launcher sat on the forecastle, loaded and ready, 24 bombs pointing into the darkness. On the bridge, Walker watched the Aztec display as the range closed. The submarine was running deep, approximately 180 feet, trying to position beneath the convoy's keel, where torpedoes would have the best angle. Range 800 yards, bearing steady. Walker had spent his career making these attacks with depth charges. He knew the frustration of losing contact in the final moments. He knew the agony of hearing explosions and seeing nothing but disturbed water. This time will be different. Range 400 yards, target steady. Fire Hedgehog. The launcher erupted. 24 bombs arced into the night sky, spreading into their oval pattern as they flew. They reached their apex 60 feet above the ship, then plunged toward the black water below. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. The bombs sank through the darkness. On the bridge, Walker held his breath. Every man on the ship held his breath. Then came the sound. Crack, crack, crack. 3 sharp detonations in rapid succession. Not the rumbling boom of depth charges. Something different. Something final. On Aztec, the submarine contact broke up into static. Moments later, debris began surfacing. Wood cork, oil, the unmistakable evidence of a destroyed submarine. Walker checked his watch. Time from first contact to confirmed kill, 8 minutes. He smiled. Signal to convoy. 1 submarine destroyed. Resuming station. But the night was not over. At 0427 hours, HMS Vetch reported another contact. At 0512 hours, HMS Gardenia found a third. At 0558 hours, Walker himself engaged a 4th submarine that had been trailing the convoy. Each attack followed the same pattern. Precise tracking, Hedgehog salvo, sharp cracks of contact detonation, debris on the surface. By dawn, 4 U-boats were at the bottom of the Atlantic. The convoy had not lost a single ship. Walker's report reached the Admiralty 3 days later. Vice Admiral Noble read it in silence. His face showed no expression as he reviewed the numbers. For submarines destroyed in 6 hours. 0 merchant losses. Hedgehog success rate, 100%. The mathematics were undeniable. In a single night, Walker's 4 ships had achieved what an entire escort group with depth charges might accomplish in months. Noble set the report down. He had been wrong. He knew it. Everyone who read this report would know it. He picked up his telephone and called the First Sea Lord. I am recommending immediate acceleration of the Hedgehog program. All available escort vessels are to be converted as quickly as possible. The order went out that afternoon. Within weeks, shipyards across Britain were installing. Strength. 2 merchant ships suffered structural damage and had to reduce speed. The convoy formation scattered across 20 miles of churning ocean. The escort commanders faced an impossible choice: maintain the scattered formation and risk submarine attack on isolated vessels, or slow the entire convoy to regroup and extend the crossing time by 2 days. They chose to regroup. It was the correct tactical decision. It also gave the German submarines time to position themselves directly in the convoy's path. On the morning of April 14th, ASTIC operators aboard the escort vessels began detecting unusual contact patterns, fleeting returns, possible biologics. Nothing definitive. The operators logged the contacts and continued sweeping. They did not know that 7 submarines were waiting less than 50 miles ahead. At 2,347 hours on April 14th, HMS Dorado reported a firm contact bearing 315 degrees. Commander William Jessup ordered action stations and vectored 2 additional escorts to support. The hunt was beginning, but the submarine slipped away in the darkness. Contact was lost at 0012 hours. The escorts resumed their screening positions. It was a probing action. The German commander was testing the defense, measuring response times, identifying gaps in coverage. At 0847 hours on April 15th, the real attack began. HMS Swale detected a solid contact bearing 220 degrees at 1,400 yards. Commander James Rowley recognized the signature immediately. This was no biologic. This was a submarine positioning for attack. Rowley brought his ship around. Speed 15 knots, bearing closing. ASTIC contact firm and steady. The submarine was U-448. Commander Helmut Dowder had survived 37 depth charge attacks across 6 war patrols. He knew the rhythm of these engagements. He knew when to dive, when to turn, when to wait. He did not know about the weapon mounted on Swale's FOCSLE. Range 800 yards, contact steady. Depth estimated 200 feet, range 600 yards, target maneuvering, coming shallow. Range 400 yards, fire Hedgehog. 24 bombs arced into the gray morning sky. They spread into their oval pattern. They reached apex. They plunged toward the water. 3 seconds of silence, then the cracks. Crack, crack, crack. 3 contact detonations in rapid succession. The sound echoed through the convoy. On U-448, the world ended in an instant. The first bomb struck near the bow and punched through the pressure hull. The second hit amidships and ruptured the control room. The third penetrated the engine compartment. Water flooded in at crushing pressure. Men died before they could scream. The submarine broke apart and sank in pieces. Time from contact to kill, 8 minutes. Rowley checked his ASTIC. The contact was gone. Oil and debris were surfacing. Signal convoy. 1 submarine destroyed. Continuing patrol. But there was no time to celebrate. At 0903 hours, HMS Dorado reported a new contact bearing 045 degree, range 1,100 yards. This was U-473. Commander Sternberg had heard the attack on U-448. He knew something terrible had happened. He ordered emergency dive and maximum speed, try to escape the area before the escorts could localize him. It did not matter. HMS Dorado closed the range. ASTIC contact remained firm. The submarine twisted and turned, but could not break the lock. At 0911 hours, Dorado fired its Hedgehog salvo. 2 bombs struck U-473, 1 near the conning tower, 1 in the battery compartment. The detonations cracked the pressure hull in 3 places. Sternberg ordered emergency surface. It was his only chance. The submarine broke through the waves at a steep angle. Men scrambled onto the tilted deck. They had seconds to abandon ship. They did not have seconds. U-473 slid backward into the Atlantic and sank. 12 men made it into the water. All 12 died of hypothermia within 20 minutes. Time from contact to kill, 11 minutes. Total elapsed time, 24 minutes. 2 submarines destroyed. The remaining 5 German commanders heard everything on their hydrophones. The sharp cracks of the new weapon. The screaming metal of imploding hulls. The silence that followed. Some panicked. Some froze. Some tried to run. None escaped. At 0919 hours, HMS Dorado destroyed U-10001 with a single salvo. At 0923 hours, HMS Dean caught U-392 attempting to dive beneath the convoy and killed it with 3 contact detonations. At 0927 hours, HMS Dorado scored again, sinking U-515 at 280 feet. The attacks came so fast that the escort commanders lost count. Aztec operators called out contacts. Hedgehog crews fired salvos. Sharp cracks echoed across the water. Oil slicks appeared on the surface. At 0931 hours, HMS Dorado and HMS Dean coordinated an attack on U-731. Both ships fired simultaneously. 7 bombs struck the submarine. It disintegrated. At 0937 hours, U-856 became the 7th and final victim. The submarine had been running silent at 300 feet, deeper than any Type VII was designed to operate. The crew thought they were safe. They were wrong. HMS Swale's Aztec operator detected a faint return and tracked it for 4 minutes. Commander Rowley positioned his ship with surgical precision. The Hedgehog salvo dropped through 300 feet of dark water. 1 bomb struck U-856's upper hull and penetrated the pressure hull. At that depth, the explosion was catastrophic. The entire submarine imploded in less than 1 second. Time: 0937 hours. 7 submarines destroyed. 30 minutes elapsed. 231 German sailors dead. 0 merchant ships lost. 0 Allied casualties. Commander Rowley stood on the bridge of HMS Swale and watched the last oil slick spread across the gray Atlantic. He had been hunting submarines for 3 years. He had never seen anything like this. He wrote in his personal journal that evening, 7 boats in half an hour. The mathematics of this war have changed forever. We're no longer fighting to survive. We are fighting to win. The news spread through the Royal Navy within hours. 7 submarines, 30 minutes. The numbers seemed impossible. They were not impossible. They were just new. Vice Admiral Noble, the man who had tried to kill the Hedgehog program 2 years earlier, sent a personal message to Charles Goodeve. It contained 2 words: "You won." The impact rippled outward in waves. Escort commanders who had been skeptical of the new weapon demanded immediate installation. Training programs expanded to accommodate the surge in demand. Production facilities added night shifts. Within 3 months, every escort vessel in the Atlantic carried Hedgehog launchers. The statistics told the story of a transformed war. In 1942, U-boats sank 1,664 Allied ships. In 1943, with limited Hedgehog deployment, losses fell to 597 ships. In 1944, with full deployment, losses collapsed to 205 ships. Meanwhile, German submarine casualties exploded. 237 U-boats destroyed in 1943, 241 in 1944. The casualty rate among German submariners reached 75%, the highest of any military branch in any nation during the entire war. Admiral Donitz received a report from convoy HX-286 on April 17th. 7 boats lost, no merchant ships damaged. The admiral sat alone in his office for an hour before responding. His orders were simple: suspend offensive operations in the North Atlantic, pending tactical review. It was the end of the Wolfpack era. The strategy that had nearly starved Britain into submission was finished. The Hedgehog had won the Battle of the Atlantic. Charles Goodeve received the Order of the British Empire for his contributions. Captain Frederick Walker, the man who had risked his career to prove the weapon worked, was promoted to captain and continued hunting submarines until his death from a stroke in 1944, worn out by 3 years of constant combat. The weapon they designed together saved an estimated 500,000 tons of shipping in the final year of the war. It protected the supply lines that fed the Allied invasion of Normandy. It ensured that the convoys kept sailing and the troops kept arriving. The Hedgehog changed submarine warfare forever. But the story is not over. What happened to Charles Goodeve after the war? What legacy did he leave beyond the weapon that bears his name? And what lessons does his story hold for us today 80 years later. There is one final chapter to the story. A chapter about a man who changed history and then disappeared into obscurity. A chapter about recognition delayed, credit denied, and the strange fate of heroes in peacetime. In Part 4, we will discover what became of the man who designed the impossible weapon. We will learn why his name appears in almost no history books, and we will understand why his story matters more today than ever before. The battle beneath the waves was won, but the battle for memory was just beginning. In Part 1, Charles Goodeve designed a weapon that the Royal Navy called impossible. In Part 2, he fought admirals who wanted to bury his invention. In Part 3, we witnessed the most devastating 30 minutes in submarine warfare history, when 7 U-boats were destroyed and the Battle of the Atlantic was won. The Hedgehog changed everything. It saved hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping. It protected the supply lines that fed the Allied invasion of Normandy. It killed more than 50 German and Japanese submarines. It turned the hunters into the hunted. But what happened to the man who made it all possible? This story has one final twist that almost no one knows. Because Charles Goodeve, the civilian engineer who changed the course of World War II, was almost completely erased from history. And the reason why will shock you. Success, it turns out, sometimes comes with a price that no one expects. When the war ended in 1945, Charles Goodeve was 41 years old. He had spent 4 years designing weapons for the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development. The Hedgehog was his masterpiece, but it was not his only contribution. He had developed degaussing systems that protected ships from magnetic mines. He had created new methods for clearing minefields. He had solved dozens of technical problems that saved thousands of lives. For his service, Goodeve received the Order of the British Empire in 1942. He was promoted to commander in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. He received letters of commendation from admirals who had once mocked his ideas. But when the war ended, Goodeve did not become a celebrity. He did not write memoirs. He did not give interviews about his wartime exploits. He returned to civilian life and took a position as the director of the British Iron and Steel Research Association, a job that had nothing to do with weapons or warfare. Why would a man who had contributed so much simply walk away from recognition? The answer lies in the nature of wartime secrecy. The Hedgehog program was classified. The specific details of its development, the trials, the failures, the political battles within the Admiralty, all of it remained locked in government files for decades. Goodeve could not discuss his most significant achievement, even if he wanted to. But there was another reason, one that speaks to the character of the man himself. Goodeve believed that the Hedgehog's success belonged to the crews who operated it, not the engineer who designed it. He told colleagues that the men who sailed into the North Atlantic and faced submarines deserved the credit. He considered himself merely a technician who had solved a technical problem. The bravery, the sacrifice, the victory belonged to others. This humility cost him his place in history. Captain Frederick Walker, the man who had risked his career to prove the Hedgehog worked, did not live to see the war's end. He died of a stroke on July 9, 1944, at the age of 48. The official cause was exhaustion. 3 years of constant combat, endless patrols, and the stress of command had worn out his heart. Walker was buried with full naval honors. He was recognized as the most successful anti-submarine commander in Royal Navy history. His name appears in textbooks and documentaries. Museums display artifacts from his ships. Goodeve's name appears almost nowhere. Vice Admiral Percy Noble, the man who had tried to kill the Hedgehog program, retired in 1945 and spent his remaining years writing about naval strategy. In his memoirs, he mentioned the Hedgehog briefly and took no responsibility for delaying its deployment. He died in 1955, remembered as a distinguished naval officer. Admiral Karl Donitz, the German commander who had called the Hedgehog impossible, survived the war and served 10 years in Spandau prison for war crimes. He never publicly acknowledged how completely the British weapon had defeated his submarine force. Goodeve outlived them all. He continued working in industrial research until his death in 1980 at the age of 76. His obituary mentioned his wartime service in passing. It did not mention the Hedgehog by name, but the legacy of his invention lived on in ways he never could have imagined. The Hedgehog remained in active service with the Royal Navy until the 1960s. It was adopted by the United States Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, the Royal Australian Navy, and a dozen other allied fleets. More than 3,000 launchers were manufactured during and after the war. The weapon's influence extended far beyond its original design. The Squid system, which entered service in 1944, used the same forward-throwing principle with larger bombs and automated fire control. The Limbo system, introduced in the 1950s, refined the concept further and remained in Royal Navy service until 1992. Modern anti-submarine warfare still uses principles that Goodeve pioneered. The ASROC system deployed by the United States Navy fires rocket-propelled torpedoes to submarine locations, maintaining continuous tracking until the moment of attack. The ICARA system developed by Australia uses similar principles. Contemporary vertical launch systems on warships can deliver precision-guided munitions with accuracy that Goodeve could only have dreamed of. The core insight remains unchanged. Maintain contact, attack forward, achieve precision. Between 1943 and 1945, Hedgehog-equipped ships sank 47 German submarines and 6 Japanese submarines. Those 53 confirmed kills represented more than 5,000 enemy sailors. But the defensive impact was even greater. The presence of Hedgehog-equipped escorts deterred attacks that would otherwise have occurred. Submarines that broke off engagements rather than face the new weapon represented ships that were not sunk, cargoes that arrived safely, and lives that were saved. Conservative estimates suggest that the Hedgehog directly or indirectly protected more than 2 million tons of shipping during the final 2 years of the war. At the standard calculation of 1 merchant sailor per 100 tons of cargo, that represents 20,000 lives preserved, 20,000 fathers who came home, 20,000 sons who survived, 20,000 men who lived to grow old because a civilian engineer refused to accept that depth charges were good enough. But the true legacy of Charles Goodeve is not measured in ships saved or submarines sunk. It is measured in the lesson his story teaches about innovation, resistance, and the courage to challenge established thinking. Goodeve was not a military officer. He had no authority to order anyone to do anything. He could not pull rank or threaten careers. All he had was an idea and the determination to prove it worked. The Royal Navy in 1942 was one of the most tradition-bound institutions on Earth. It had ways of doing things that dated back centuries. Depth charges had been the standard anti-submarine weapon since 1916. 26 years of doctrine, training, and institutional memory said that dropping explosives from the stern of a ship was the correct approach. Goodeve looked at that doctrine and asked a simple question: what if we are wrong? That question nearly ended his career. It earned him enemies among senior officers who resented a civilian questioning their expertise. It resulted in his program being suspended and his ideas being dismissed as propaganda. But he persisted. He found allies like Captain Walker who were willing to take risks. He conducted tests that proved his theories. He built weapons that worked. And eventually the results became impossible to ignore. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The tank was dismissed as a useless curiosity by cavalry officers who could not imagine warfare without horses. Radar was rejected by admirals who trusted their lookouts more than electronic devices. Jet engines were opposed by experts who believed propellers would always be superior. Innovation almost always faces resistance from those who benefit from the existing system. The people who mastered depth charge tactics did not want to learn new methods. The commanders who had built their careers on conventional warfare did not want to admit that their approach was failing. Goodeve's genius was not just technical. It was political. He understood that proving a weapon worked in tests was not enough. He had to prove it in combat under conditions that skeptics could not dismiss. Captain Walker's convoy action provided that proof. The destruction of 7 submarines in 30 minutes provided that proof beyond any possible doubt. The lesson applies far beyond military history. Every organization, whether it is a navy, a corporation, or a government, develops institutional resistance to change. New ideas threaten existing hierarchies. Innovation disrupts comfortable routines. People who have invested their careers in old methods resist being told those methods are obsolete. Breaking through that resistance requires more than being right. It requires persistence, allies, and the opportunity to demonstrate results that cannot be ignored. And there is one final detail about Charles Goodeve that almost no one knows. In 1979, 1 year before his death, Goodeve was contacted by a researcher working on a history of the Battle of the Atlantic. The researcher asked if Goodeve would provide an interview about his wartime work. After decades of silence, the classification restrictions had finally been lifted. Goodeve agreed to the interview. For the first time in 35 years, he spoke publicly about the Hedgehog's development. He described the early failures, the political battles with Admiral Noble, the secret tests with Captain Walker, and the moment when he learned that his weapon had destroyed 7 submarines in 30 minutes. The researcher asked Goodeve if he felt bitter about being forgotten, while others received credit for winning the Battle of the Atlantic. Goodeve's response was recorded and preserved in the Imperial War Museum archives. He said, "I designed a machine. The men who operated that machine in freezing water and hurricane winds against an enemy who wanted to kill them, they're the ones who won the battle. I sat in a laboratory. They sailed into hell. There is no comparison." He paused for a moment, then added, "Besides, the best weapons are the ones that make themselves unnecessary." By 1944, the Germans feared the Hedgehog so much that they stopped attacking convoys. Ships arrived safely, not because we sank submarines, but because submarines were afraid to fight. That is victory. That is what I wanted. Not medals, not recognition, just ships arriving safely. Charles Goodeve died on April 3, 1980. He was 76 years old. His funeral was attended by family and colleagues from his post-war research career. No admirals were present. No military honors were rendered. The man who had changed submarine warfare was buried as a civilian. But in navies around the world, his principles are still taught. In shipyards, weapons based on his designs are still manufactured. In the cold waters of the North Atlantic, the wrecks of submarines destroyed by his invention still rest on the ocean floor. And every time an anti-submarine vessel maintains contact while attacking forward, every time precision targeting replaces brute force, every time a new idea overcomes institutional resistance to save lives, the legacy of Charles Goodeve lives on. From a civilian engineer with an idea that admirals called impossible to a weapon that destroyed 53 enemy submarines and saved 20,000 merchant sailors, Charles Goodeve proved that innovation does not require authority. It requires persistence. It requires allies willing to take risks. And it requires the courage to challenge experts who insist that the old ways are the only ways. 7 submarines, 30 minutes, 231 enemy sailors dead, 0 Allied casualties, 0 merchant ships lost. That is what one man with one idea accomplished when he refused to accept that good enough was good enough. And that is why his story deserves to be remembered, even if he never wanted the recognition for himself. The Battle of the Atlantic was won by thousands of sailors on hundreds of ships over 6 years of brutal combat. But it was also won in laboratories and workshops by engineers who asked simple questions and refused to accept easy answers. Charles Goodeve asked, "What if we fire forward instead of dropping behind?" That question changed everything. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon is not a bomb or a torpedo. It is an idea that challenges what everyone believes to be true. The Hedgehog was that kind of weapon, and the man who created it was that kind of thinker. In a world that often rewards conformity, Charles Goodeve stood for something different. He stood for the belief that better solutions exist if we have the courage to find them. If you know similar stories of forgotten innovators who changed history, share them in the comments below. The world is full of Charles Goodeves whose names never made the history books, but whose ideas shaped the world we live in. This is just one of hundreds of innovations that changed World War II. Subscribe to discover more stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things when their nations needed them most. Because history is not made only by generals and admirals. It is made by engineers and mechanics and ordinary sailors who refused to accept that impossible meant impossible. And sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply the willingness to ask, what if everyone else is?